and I'm most disappointed in such action. Therefore, I do not think I should take any further part in the deliberation of this issue. We cannot, as a committee, compromise the importance of this committee by leaving the committee to go into a back room or a side room to discuss the people's business. There's nothing and nowhere in the standing order or term of reference say that we should give up that right and meet in some side room or back room. Any issue to be dealt with by this committee is an issue that must be minuted. The answers and deliberation must be minuted. And I'm totally disappointed. But if it's going to be minuted, why are you going to back room to discuss it?
The Hansard was present, and the minutes are going to be maintained and prepared. It will be in the minutes. Yes.
Then if it is going to be in the minutes, can you tell me the importance or the relevance of going to back room?
Yeah. Anyway, Member Warmington, I don't know if you're recusing yourself from any further participation in the committee or not.
I think I should, because you compromise this position at the meeting.
That's entirely up to you. That's entirely up to you, sir. I propose now to give a report on what took place, a summary report of what took place in the closed meeting. So we met in closed session on the issue, which the Permanent Secretary felt, on the basis of legal advice she had received from the Attorney General's chambers, that she could not provide to us in open sitting. And she said that her advice was that if we sought the information adamantly and we wanted it, we should get it in a closed sitting. So we went into a closed sitting and we received the information as to what was the situation there in relation to the separation of the human resource manager. The representative of Petrojam indicated that since Petrojam was a party to the contract that had been signed for the separation, the confidentiality clause was binding on Petrojam, and they didn't feel they should disclose information which they'd agreed to maintain confidentiality of. That was their position. The Permanent Secretary is not a party to that contract, and she was prepared to and provided the information to us in the closed sitting. And there was also an indication that there's a provision in one of the statutes which may provide some further protection in that regard, and she would be communicating directly with the clerk if she sought to invoke that protection. So that is what took place. In terms of what we were told, I think it's our obligation to state it for the record publicly what took place, because we are playing a role here as an oversight body, and information that we receive is not private information, it's public information, as has been indicated by Member Warmington. So, by way of summary, the human resource manager was compensated arising from her termination. And the figures that we were given somewhat differed between the contract that was signed and the actual payout slip, but in essence, she received a gross payout in the tune of 8 months compensation, which amounted to some $9.2 million gross, from which certain deductions were made in respect of various obligations that she had that were met out of that. So that at the end of the day, her net compensation was at roughly $4.189 million. So that is what was paid to the HR manager in order to have her separated from Petrojam. The next item was the general manager himself. The next question related to the general manager himself.
Chair.
Yes.
Before you move on from the HR, because I'm sure we were told that there was investigations being carried out by by Petrojam itself in some of her actions, and it would be good to find out if those have been completed, and if not, how did they arrive to a payout then?
But Chairman, before you answer the question, if you can disclose to the meeting the deliberation and the figures, about 9.2 million, then why couldn't be done in the open before you go into back room? If you can come back and read to us what was said in that room. But you went to the back room too?
No.
Why go into the back room to discuss it? If you can, I'm not going in the back room to discuss anything that has to do with Jamaican people's business. It must be discussed here. And if you can come back to this meeting and disclose that, why go into some back room to discuss it? That's not why I come here. Yes, but it's not the room to deliberate. Yeah. We deliberate right here in
the Parliament. Reason we repaired to that room, Mr. Warmington, is because the Permanent Secretary indicated that she wasn't prepared to disclose it to us in open sitting. Having heard the information, I felt it is our responsibility to state the information that we received, because we didn't get that information in a private capacity. So I've just provided a summary of what took place. So you were asking a question.
I was asking Mr. Watson.
So, Chairman, we did start an investigation which led to a hearing, a disciplinary hearing taking place. The hearing was moving very slowly, and at the end of the termination, we agreed to terminate, we suspended the hearing. But we did start a hearing based on the investigations we had carried out.
Well, and that, because, well, for you to reach to that point, there must be something why would drive you to want to start a hearing.
Part of it was, we had information, we were carrying out a hearing.
Yeah.
Part of it is that the hearing was being delayed, so it was being dragged over.
Who was carrying out this hearing?
No, the company would have appointed a panel of
no, right.
And so we had our legal counsel, we had an external counsel, and the HR manager had her legal counsel as well, and we were going through the process.
But wouldn't it have been to the benefit of Petrojam to complete these hearings, or to have your legal, whichever team it is, complete the hearings before compensation?
Part of the difficulty is that the hearing, as I said, was being extended over a long period. So you were going to a hearing and you were saying, I have no confidence in you, I don't want to work with you. And then when the hearing finished at 1 o'clock, you have to go back to the office, and then you have to work with the same person. And we had a lot of HR matters that were piling up and piling up.
And also seeing that the Integrity Commission was also looking into the matters that dealt with the HR manager and certain operations. Wouldn't it have suited also Petrojam to wait on the results of that before, just similar how you have sent home your FC in a matter like that?
All right. So the matter is that what we have done doesn't stop the Integrity Commission or MOCA from doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
So that's one. But the difficulty I was having on the company is that you're trying to run a business, you have a lot of HR issues, but you technically cannot function with an HR department with a manager that shouldn't be there. Now, I suppose the alternative is you could send home the HR manager and pay her, which is pretty much what we are right.
And the reason why I raise it is because I have an issue as an employer also, right? To having to have an incompetent person within your organization, and then a reward for incompetence is to pay them off, to send them off, and we're speaking about public funds in this instance. And you know, it sets up bad precedent, one, and it's very messy in how it was done. And I would have hoped to have heard that these were the findings, and if it is that the company itself was managing the process of the interviews with her, then you could have sped it up in a way to meet your requirements of what it is that you are looking for. If it was termination, yes, but then am I going to pay you out just to get rid of you because I want to function, but yet still we know that there are issues that may come up that she shouldn't even have gotten full compensation.
So in setting the hearing dates, it's her lawyer being available and our legal counsel as well. What we realized that this thing was extending into 6 months and possibly even going longer. And then at the same time, we had a business to run that was not able to function. It was just too many conflicts taking place. And that was a big part of the decision in how we decided to terminate the hearing.
Member Johnson.
So, Chair, further to the point raised by Member Phillips, I recall in the PAAC meeting, the then acting general manager of Petrojam indicated that one of the rules of Petrojam prohibits certain practices like nepotism, hiring of someone in their own family. And that was one of a few provisions that warrants immediate dismissal. Against the background of the prevailing rules at Petrojam, why was it necessary to seek a negotiated settlement with an employee where you have clear breach of existing policy? An action, Mr. Chairman, that ends up providing a $9.2 million settlement with such employee, though in breach of the company rules. I question that, and I would like the Auditor General to make inquiry and advise the committee accordingly. I know she probably would not now have the prevailing company rules, but I would like some advice in due.
One thing, and then Member Guide and Member Daly.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's useful to read Petrojam, and I'm a highly qualified HR manager in place who was dismissed summarily immediately before Christmas without cause. And I gather that matter is before the IDT now, and at least 1 year's compensation has been put on the table already, and it might end up higher than that for the unjust dismissal. Very irregular advertising of the post was done through a non-Petrojam email address, non-company email address. The successful applicant was at the time a director of the parent company, PCJ, who was accelerated through the employment process at a salary, first of all, did not meet the requirements for the position, did not have the qualifications for the position, but nonetheless was hired at a salary almost twice that of the previous incumbent who had the qualifications, who met the qualifications. Within the normal probationary period, it was waived and they were given
a 30% increase in salary in 6 weeks to over 13 million. Then that person has worked, and it is alleged that this salary was 4 or 5 or 6 times what the incumbent had previously earned in the private sector. And then now we end up for 1 year and 9 months actual service at Petrojam paying $32 million. Mr. Chairman, this is scandalous. Absolute. I mean, it is a case study of nepotism, cronyism, corruption, misconduct, fraud. I mean, you name it. I mean, this symbolizes everything that should not be done.
Comments reached a settlement without resolving the issues that were on the table in relation to that person, and so she has received a compensation payment without those issues having in fact been resolved as well. So overall, it's a highly irregular.
I have one.
Go ahead, member.
Chairman.
Dr. Guy. Dr. Guy.
Sorry.
Yeah. And then Mr. Daly.
Mr. Watson, in answer to Member Phillips' question, you indicated negotiating period and the challenges that you had in that the HR manager had to come Monday morning, as it were, and interact and do work. So there was a little tension, and that was one of the considerations which accelerated getting to the position of settlement. But Petrojam has a well-established position where people who are at contrary positions to the company, you have found a way to deal with them to allow the operations of the company to go along. You'll recall last week you mentioned garden leave. Why was she not sent on garden leave until you resolved those issues that were there, and hence you might not have reached to the state where you had to have a $9.2 million settlement?
Why wasn't that methodology employed in her case?
Well, part of the reason with the sending the HR manager off and continuing is that we would have ended up in a situation where you would have been paying the incumbent while you're carrying out the process. And at the end of the day, we said, look, if this thing is going to drag on for another 6-7 months, then let's just make a clean break at this moment. So we took the decision not to extend having the person there, because if you send on garden leave, you'd still have been paying the money and still have the issues to be resolved. So that was why we did not decide to take that route and continue paying the individual.
So, Mr. Watson, lastly, so
Wait,
from
sorry, Member Phillips. Member Daly, do you want to, because you were next. Go ahead, Member Phillips.
I wanted something to be confirmed. Chairman, let me just take I just wanted Mr. Watson to confirm something. Member Jackson indicated, referred to the policy of Petrojam about hiring of relatives. Can you confirm that there exists such a policy, and what's the consequence laid down in the policy if you employ a relative in the company?
I mentioned to Member Jackson that there is a policy, but I can't remember the consequences, and I told him I would check and refer back. Yes.
Can we ask that that policy be provided to us?
Sure.
Yeah, the entire policy. If we would, we would like to see that. Member Jackson, Member Phillips, and Member Hannah. That was the order. Yes. just a short, and then remember this.
Yeah, it's a short question, really to you, maybe more so in your legal capacity, and to the accountant, the auditor general. In a case like this, where you have an agreed settlement, which is in breach of company rules, is there any recourse for recovery of such funds? Yeah. Is there any recourse for recovery? Because my understanding, if you come by a gain in breach of law, it's deemed an ill-gotten gain, and the state has the right to retrieve those ill-gotten gain, because the state would have suffered from the person benefiting accordingly. So my question is, do we have a recourse? Because I do believe that this must not be allowed to end here. Otherwise, we will be rewarding corruption, and we will be encouraging further corruption, not only in the public sector, but in all other spheres of national life.
Well, Auditor General, I don't know if you want to tackle that one.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I respond humbly to say that Member Jackson is really asking a legal question that I think I am not apt to answer. But what I would do is to respond to a question which was asked earlier by Member Hanna in relation to what action could be taken against the board of directors or a public officer who has been identified as conducting some malfeasance. So Section 20 of the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act makes it very clear that a board and all other persons charged with governance must obtain the approval from the Ministry of Finance as it pertains to emoluments. Section 25 now provides the action that can be taken against a board as well as public officer. That's an action that is taken through the Attorney General, and it prescribes the applicable provision for which, if there's a breach of that provision, Section 20 is one such, and Section 6, corporate governance. So where a board can be proved to be in breach of the corporate governance practices or provisions, then action can be taken. That, of course, is quite separate, Chairman, from the surcharge proceedings, which allows for the Auditor General to make a recommendation to the Ministry of Finance for action. As it pertains to the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, action must go through the courts. And there is a restriction of $1 million that can be imposed as a pecuniary fine.
I mean, that's the cap?
Yes, that's the cap.
So, and it's the Attorney General who would have to invoke those proceedings, right?
Yes.
No, not a surcharge. There's no surcharge for public bodies like Petrojam.
No.
We've already pointed this out as being a major gap in the whole governance architecture, that the surcharge provisions only apply to central government and not to public statutory bodies.
I must say, though, that provision has never been tested. And the representatives from the Ministry of Finance probably can provide better particulars here, because I think what we do not have is the regulations that would guide us through how you go about enacting that particular provision.
Could I ask? Yeah. Go ahead, Madam.
I would like to find out if the Ministry of Finance had sanctioned the settlement, and if the board had approved the settlement.
Yeah, that was the question I was going to ask you. What was the process by which the settlement with the former HR manager was approved? Who approved
the board and the Ministry of Finance.
The board and the Ministry of Finance approved this?
That's correct.
I see.
No, it's the current board.
The current board. The current board agreed pay this
That's correct.
settlement.
That's correct.
All right.
Further to that question
Yes.
by Member Daly. Mr. Chair, you'll recall when the matter came before the Parliament, the Prime Minister indicated that with the portfolio being shifted to the office of the Prime Minister, he would ensure oversight, proper oversight, in light of the former minister's failure in providing oversight. Can the PS indicated that when this recommendation came from the board, that the Prime Minister, whether or not the Prime Minister was advised of the recommendation that the entity is about to enter into?
Yes. Was this settlement brought to your attention? Did you sign off on it? Did you bring it to the Prime Minister's attention as a responsible minister?
So, Chairman, I would not have been at the office of the Prime Minister at the time when this settlement would have taken place.
Can we find out, please, whether your predecessor had approved it, and was it brought to the attention of the Prime Minister and indeed the Cabinet?
I will check on that, Chairman.
Just another point.
Yes, ma'am.
Who was the acting permanent secretary before the current one at the time?
When the then minister demitted office,
Or who had put permanent secretary oversight function at the time?
Permanent Secretary Sewell.
Mr. Is anyone in the office of the Prime Minister could advise the committee?
But, Mr. Chair, I don't
Yes.
think
Mr. Witter.
you could have gotten approval from the Ministry of Finance, and that it passed through the Ministry of Science and Technology.
well,
I think that is the channel that it
Mr.
goes
Watson has said that it was approved by the Ministry of Finance.
Right.
He has
So it
said
would
that.
have-
I would like to hear from the responsible ministry what the process was by which this particular settlement was agreed to and authorized. I've heard it from the GM of Petrojam. I would like to hear it from the permanent secretary in the office of the Prime Minister. Because my understanding is at the time that this took place, which was on November last year, this ministry was part of the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, essentially, or was subsumed in the office of the-
Correction.
Correct me, please.
I work in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. The Petrojam does not fall under that portfolio.
So which?
It's
given
the office of the Prime Minister.
So the minister.
No.
Yes. Answer me this, Mr. Wellington. The responsible minister for energy is currently the Prime Minister.
Yes.
And it's done through a separate ministry than
No, it's under the Prime Minister's office.
under the Prime Minister's office.
Yeah, not under Economic Growth and Job Creation.
So he has two separate ministries, so to speak, that he's yes.
He is a portfolio minister
Yes.
for the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation.
And for energy.
Energy went to Office of Prime Minister,
Yeah. All right.
not the other
Well,
entity.
PS, we would like to hear from you as to how this particular settlement was authorized. What was the procedure by which it was authorized? And we have been told by the general manager that it went to the board, and the new board authorized it. And he's also indicated that the Ministry of Finance authorized it. We would like to know whether the ministry that had assumed responsibility, which is under the oversight of the Prime Minister himself, approved this settlement. That's what we would like to know that.
Noted, Chairman.
And when it was so approved. Yeah. Yes, well, I expect we will get this in short order because it's not a complicated thing to hear. Yeah. When do you think we can get this information, PS?
I will move expeditiously to get the information and send it forward, Chairman.
Yes.
It's a matter of going to the ministry and get the information.
Yeah.
In my experience in here in the past, sometimes we get those responses before the day end.
Yeah. PS, we'd really like to have this week, please.
Noted, Chairman.
Okay. All right, moving on. Member Hannah.
Thank you. Mr. Watson, in the context of what was just said with regards to what the AG referred to in Section 20 and the various sections, perhaps this question was asked before, but I didn't catch it. What has the general manager said as to why he gave the approval to retroactively pay this lady?
We have tried to contact the general manager subsequent to my returning, and we have not been able to get any response from him, but we have actually been trying to get him to answer some questions.
So he has disappeared? He's still living here?
As far as I know, he's not here. I think he went back to the States.
And there is nothing that can be brought to bear to ask him those questions? Because from what is being floated around in the atmosphere is that he was presented a situation and told to sign. That's why I said it was floating around.
I'm not aware of that. We have an email address from him, like a Hotmail or a Gmail address, and we have sent questions to him for response, and he has not responded. So I'm not sure.
No, but Chair, because again, this again, there are clear breaches by the general manager, but yet still, again, the general manager was given a golden handshake and said, disappear in the thin air. Same like the HR manager.
Yeah, because
and this is and I wanted to ask a question to Mr. Watson. If the options, well, he was there when the HR manager was paid out.
Yeah.
Is this the norm?
I think we should state for the record that the document that was sent to us from OPM in response to the former general manager's termination, the question was did he resign or was he fired by Petrojam? And the answer was the former general manager's contract was mutually terminated. And the second question, what were the terms of that separation and accompanying compensation afforded to the former general manager? And it said, pursuant to clause 15(1)(a) of his contract, he was paid 4 months' salary, approximately net $5.2 million. So this former general manager, who waived the probation period, who waived the nepotism violation, and God knows what else, who was paid.
Who was the person administering the management of an entity that is in front of us now because of clear breaches and incompetence.
A plethora of violations of good governance. Yes.
And it would be good to know if this person comes back and forth into the country and why. I mean, Chair, but I would like to find out though if there are any other instances like this, or the procurement manager who just left also, did she get a golden handshake like this? Who else at Petrojam who has been highlighted?
Because what we have is where no one has been held accountable for anything. They've all got payments either in accordance with their contract, in this instance $5.2 million, or discretionary payments arrived at by way of a settlement for a much bigger sum in the case of the very generous. Has anyone else been paid money for separating Mr. Watson?
That I would like to find out.
No. The procurement manager resigned. There was no payment.
But, you know, just mention on that, because I don't know if it is something that we did not pay attention to, because in everything that came up, the instances with the wall, the instances with the birthday parties and payments, the procurement manager herself would have to have signed off these invoices. Yeah? And, you know, Chair, it's so funny that when we met in December, and I said to myself that come the next meeting, that I would like to find out why is it that the procurement manager at all. We didn't even request for her to come to a meeting of either the PAAC or even this committee itself, because she's as culpable as the others. Yeah? Because who influenced her? Because it gets even deeper. Someone, senior manager, would have to influence her to sign off those invoices for payment, because the general manager himself can't sign off the invoices himself. Yeah? Well, ought not to. No, well, ought not to. Yeah? Right? But she's now gone without us being able to answer some of those questions. And on what basis did she resign? Was it something, she moved on to greener pastures? Or?
You know, my problem with this whole thing is that the minister leaves, demits office under a cloud. The prime minister assumes responsibility for this whole ministry, including Petrojam. And we're seeing these massive payouts for persons who have, on the face of it, committed all sorts of wrongful acts while they were employed. And so what kind of accountability structure is this that we're hearing? Oh, we're going to make sure there's proper oversight and everything's going to be properly run. And here we have persons who have committed wrongs towards the company receiving substantial compensation for termination. I must tell you, it really befuddles the mind how this thing is being run at a time when we're supposed to be improving. Member Jackson.
Mr. Chairman, I have a little difficulty. Yeah, when things are not clear. It's my parishioner, man. Mr. Chairman, I have a little difficulty with the response regarding the general manager. You have a settlement which is arrived at via mutual agreement. And it is only through email contact that negotiation took place. It was through mutual agreement that the general manager agreed to step aside. And you arrive at an amount for that settlement only through email contact. My question is, who are the person or persons who were negotiating with the general manager to arrive at that settlement? Who are the person or persons in order to arrive at the 5.2? No, 5.2 for the general manager and 9.2 for the HR manager. It would seem to me that somebody have some more influence than the other. The HR manager can come away with 9.2 and the general manager with 5.4. But the substantive
5.2.
5.2, sorry. Mm-hmm. I'm curious about how this settlement. Who speak to who? Who were the parties?
How was the settlement agreement negotiated with the former general manager?
But before you get the answer, I just want to posit. I just want to just posit, Chairman. The standing order gives the committee the authority to bring before the Parliament, the committee, both present and former employees of the public entities. So it is within the remit of this committee, in search for an understanding and clarification of what transpired in this old debacle, to recall both the general manager, the chairman, the procurement officer, and I submit, Chairman, if we fail to give serious consideration to those, we will be derelict in our responsibilities to the people of Jamaica. And I say that against the background, Chairman, that all this massive levels of corruption and loss from the public purse, the public entities, means that the schools cannot get proper school feeding program in place. it is what constrained the government from providing adequate pharmaceuticals in the hospitals. It is this failing that caused the roads to remain unrepaired in many communities throughout Jamaica. It is not an abstract or esoterical issue at all, and therefore ought not to be treated lightly by this committee.
Well, thank you. And the whole question of whether we call on those persons to come is something we can keep under advisement and make a decision at the appropriate time. But the question was, what was the procedure by which the general managers we were told it was a right under his contract, but how was the discussions with him conducted if he wasn't around?
I believe, I wasn't there, but I believe that he was in Jamaica at that time, because this would have happened sometime in early July or so. So I think he was in Jamaica at that time. He subsequently left.
Yes, so, Mr.
And he had a, sorry, and remember I was telling you, he had a contract. So there was a termination clause in his contract, which is what was invoked for his separation.
Yeah, but you know, that's the way you separate with him on the basis that he has done nothing wrong. But in the circumstances of this particular instance, he shouldn't have got a cent. Mr. Daly.
Yes. Chair, thank you. Mr. Watson, what was the gross settlement for the general manager? I don't know if you had said it, it escaped me, and I'm sorry if you have to repeat. But I'm not aware that you had given the committee that information, one. And to the best of your knowledge, do you have members of the previous board who are presently on the new board of Petrojam?
There isn't any member of the present board that was there prior to, if that's what you're asking. So the Jamaican members, they're all 3 new members of the Petrojam board now. They were appointed by the Prime Minister, I think in July last year.
But there are members of the Petrojam board who are, or the former Petrojam board, who are still on the PCJ board, who are still directors of Petroleum Corporation.
I believe Richard Creary is still on the PCJ board, and he was a member of the Petrojam board.
So Richard Creary was on the board of PCJ and was a PCJ representative on the Petrojam board.
He was a member of the PCJ board, and he was a member of the Petrojam board. I don't know if he was the representative.
Okay, and he's now, well, that board was a board where we had a joint venture with the Venezuelans, correct? So the Jamaican representatives really were representing the parent company that owned 51%. Is that fair to say? And so he was there, and he's still on the PCJ board.
As far as I know, he's still on the PCJ board.
Cool.
No, the question I think Mr. Bunting and Mr. Daly was asking, if the PCJ board members who were around while all this were taking place at Petrojam, who were there then, is any remaining now?
Has there been any change to the PCJ board?
No, there hasn't been any change to the PCJ board. So Richard Creary was at both places, and he's still on the PCJ.
So the parent company that was giving no effective oversight to its largest subsidiary, which is perhaps the largest commercial enterprise in the country, where we have seen the Auditor General go in and bring to light all these litany of wrongs that are taking place in there. That parent company board remains totally intact. Nobody has, including one director who was a director of Petrojam at the time.
Remember, the chairman of Petrojam then was also on the PCJ board. He has resigned. This is Bahadur Singh.
So one of them, the chairman of Petrojam.
He was also on the, not the GM.
He was the chairman of...
He was the chairman of Petrojam. He was also on the PCJ board.
He resigned.
So he has resigned.
But everyone else remains.
No, there were 3 directors. Harold Malcolm, he resigned.
From Petrojam. Yeah, but I'm talking
he
was
not on PCJ.
At the PCJ level, the only change has been that Badra
Singh resigned, right.
Yeah.
No, recall,
company we're talking about.
just for completeness, recall that the HR manager in question had
PCJ.
also been a director of PCJ,
Parent company.
and I believe chairman of the HR committee until she was appointed at Petrojam. So that would be another change at the...
But she would have resigned before she took up the HR
Right,
position.
she resigned in order to take up the post. But I'm just saying that would be a second director change at PCJ.
But in terms of what has taken place, since all this came out, the only change at the PCJ level is the chairman of Petrojam, who was on the board of PCJ, is no longer on that board. But everything else remains as is. Could you just answer the question, Mr. Watson, from Member Jackson about the gross compensation payment?
So his compensation for the 4 months would have been 7.225, 537.59. And then after you take out all the deductions, he ended up with 3.
So
there were some other deductions that came out after that.
Deductions like what, so Mr. Watson?
Like, well, more gas, like gasoline that he would have taken, so, and telephone calls and all that.
So these are amounts that he would have been owing to the company. So it's not like statutory deductions.
No, we took out statutory deductions as well.
That's before the 7.2 million?
After
you took
the
out
7.2.
After the 7.2 million.
That's correct.
So 7.2 was reduced to 5.2.
So, and then you take out some other deductions, so he ended up with 3.883.
Hold on. Let me just interject here. I say I won't take part in this meeting any further. Mr. Chairman, allow me, Mr. Chairman. I say I won't take any further part, but look.
I knew you couldn't resist.
But I'm asking.
I knew you couldn't resist.
Because I just couldn't walk away from this. The answers sent to us by the permanent secretary says that the net was 5.2. And now the general manager has given us another figure. Exactly what the figure is. She sent to Parliament a document saying 5.2, and the general manager now said 3 point something. Exactly what is the figure?
Well, it seems to be a common practice because
No,
in our last meeting,
last
meeting we got a document from another agency with a whole heap of figures that they said were wrong too. Anyway, yes, so P.S., you've told us that the net amount approximately was 5.2 million. Now we're hearing the net amount was 3.88 million.
So, Chairman, if you notice the response that I had sent, it would have said above that Petrojam's response. So I would have sought and gotten this information from Petrojam, which is what I would have combined. Some responses from OPM, responses from Petrojam, and responses from PCJ with respect to particular questions asked in respect of the various organizations. I'm going to ask Mr. Watson to clarify again as the entity from which the information came.
Just a minute.
That hasn't satisfied Mr.
I'm
Warmington.
not going there. P.S. You sent us a document this morning saying 5.2.
Which is the information that I got yesterday, member.
Your general manager says 3.4. Look now, Mr. Chairman, we need to advise the accounting. We need to advise the accounting officers when they come and they mislead Parliament. You know, there are sanctions. You know, we need to advise them that when they come here refusing to answer the questions, there are sanctions. You know, we need to advise them when they come here if they're not cooperating. There are sanctions. You know, they need to be advised. And for the life of me, I cannot understand that this morning we got one thing said 5.2 and then we're hearing 3.4. And you are saying that you got these figures from Petrojam. And Petrojam give another figure? How can Petrojam tell you 5.2 and Petrojam tell us it's 3.4?
Especially when...
Both of you need to reconcile that before we get up here today now.
And the figure is described in the document we got this morning as a net figure. But it's not a net figure. It is net of certain things, but net of certain not. Seminet.
So if I can just run through it. There's an email which says the total payment would be $5.2 million.
Don't say total payment.
You
says net.
No, I'm reading from the
No,
email.
hold on, man. No, say total. No, hold on. You're a general manager. You're answerable now. It's not the person, it's the position. You just told us that the gross was 7.2 or 7 point something. So don't tell me about the payment was 5.2.
It cost the company 7.2. What he actually got was less.
I am now reading from the actual document that the auditors would have completed, and it is the total was 7.225,537. When you deduct NIS, NHT, education, PAYE, as well as telephone and more gas, the final was 3.883,985.
Yeah, but the cost to the company was 7.2 million for this man.
7.2.
Before we go any further, I'm not taking that, I need for someone to explain to me how the PS came by 5.2. If you are reading from a document and giving us that as the net, who gave the PS 5.2?
No, we gave her the wrong.
5.2?
Yes.
Then why you give her 5.2?
Sorry?
So why you give her...
We gave her the wrong information.
Hold on. Mr. Chairman, the question I want to ask here now, the PS misled the House based on information that she got. And the general manager is not reading the correct. Right now, I don't know which is the correct one. I don't know which is to accept. PS, what sanction do you intend to take of the officers who mislead you? You need to answer that. What action do you intend to take, or do you intend to take any action? If you can't take action, this committee will take action where you are concerned.
PS, the gentleman to your left has said he gave you the wrong information. And Mr. Warmington is asking what action you propose to take to sanction him for that.
I'll certainly, Chairman, ask the Petrojam to come back with more details and reconciliation. I am not sure, to be honest, that there is anything in the PBMA that would prescribe action for errors that might have been made.
Mr. Chairman, the PS, right now, what I'm seeing, the PS is lost totally. The PS is in another world. What is she saying to us?
No, but...
What is the PS saying to us? To come back with correction? Hold on, Mr. Watson. Hold on. Oh. I'm talking to the PS now. You're telling me now, don't go down the road. You're telling me now that you don't know what action you can take? You have to first you said they need to come back to correct.
Member Warmington, what would you recommend action? What action would you recommend?
I'm not going to tell her. She's a accounting officer. She must know what action she's going to take.
All right. So she has indicated.
Tell us that she
has indicated that she's going to ask for reconciliation of the numbers so we can get the correct numbers.
I can ask for reconciliation based on the reconciliation figures and an explanation, Chairman, as to where the error might have occurred. Then I would have to then see what action can be taken. Certainly a very strong letter can be written to the general manager where an error has been made in sending the information. I'm looking at various documents in the folder here, and there are some documents that would have showed the $5 million, which is a letter that would have been sent to Mr. Gridley.
On a matter like this, we meet last week. We set a meeting for this week. Certain questions were asked last week, and they're coming up here now. And you know that that is happening, and you know the temperature of this issue and so on. How did you communicate wrong information to the permanent secretary?
We got the request yesterday, Chairman, and I think it was sent prior to. So there's a letter here signed by the chairman that speaks to the 5.2 million, and then there's another document that has the final calculation which the auditors would go through and verify. When we picked up the information for the PS, they picked it up from the information that was sent to by the chairman, signed by the chairman, and that is the 5.2.
That's the chairman of Petrojam.
Chairman of Petrojam.
So he wrote to the PS?
No, he wrote to the general manager as part of the termination and said, this is the agreed figure.
Oh.
But it would be subject to the auditors compiling. So the information that was conveyed to the PS was based on that 5.2. Subsequent to paying the general manager, you would have the auditors come in and do a final audit and look at telephone calls, any other charges that were made. And that is how we arrived at a 3.8. So this should have been the final.
Mr. Watson, you remember last week I had asked the internal auditor a question, and there's a reason. And everybody else might have a position and an angst with which they ask questions, and they sit with a certain degree of discomfort. The reason why I'm so uncomfortable with how the management of Petrojam has been run is this company made a profit of about 35 million US between 2015 and 2016. And when I looked at the numbers again, in 2018, it actually fell to about 15 million. So when you're looking at the management of the company, and anybody can look at that information is there, you're recognizing that one of the most profitable entities that is in Jamaica is badly managed at every single level. If this was a private sector company, everybody would be fired.
No, but remember,
and heads would roll.
No. If you make a profit of $30 million, your profit is driven by the price of oil.
I'm not saying
no. The following year. So it is possible for the price to reduce.
But we can argue the semantics of it. And we can argue the deliberations of why that happened.
Okay.
Whether it is sales, losses, etc. The fact is that this is a profitable company. If the company, Mr. Chairman, made 35 million US in 2015, 2016, it is one of the most profitable companies on our books as a Jamaican government. My concern is that when Warming is getting impatient, and all of us are getting impatient because we're trying to get answers, if an HR manager can just present and get a retroactive increase in their salary, and other persons can do as they like in this company that is really making money at half its capacity, because remember now, the refinery has not been expanded. When I look through the report, and I even see the overruns in terms of contract violations were 50% more in terms of the dock. It is an incompetent management structure in Petrojam. And if you have this kind of thing, that is why we're getting so upset. It's not a matter of us trying to make people feel uncomfortable, but for those of us who are sitting here and reading through the documentation, it is egregious.
I just want to explain the difference in the profitability that is driven by prices.
Yeah, I don't think we need to go down.
Just to go back to the point,
because that whole question of the economic viability of Petrojam is an issue we're going to get to, but I don't think that's for today. So I'd ask you not to try and explain that.
No, I'm just saying that there was an error in the two numbers.
Yeah, we're trying to. You've explained that somehow the chairman had signed a letter which was part of the record and which had picked up this 5.2, and then subsequently a reconciliation was done, and which led to certain deductions being taken out of it. But unfortunately, you didn't communicate that to the permanent secretary, so she provided Parliament with wrong information.
So the letter after she writes it to him, a strong letter.
This is the final number.
P.S.
Yes, John.
The audited financial statements for Petrojam for the 2017-18 financial year. Last time we were told that they had been signed, but I don't believe they have yet been tabled in Parliament, have they? No. When are we going? I would like to see them. When can we see them?
So Chairman, it was, as advised last week, completed and has now been signed. But the annual report is now being prepared, yes?
Can we see the audited financial statements now? I don't need to see the annual. I don't want to wait on any annual report. I'd like to see the audited financial statements for 17-18, 16-17, and 15-16, the last 3 years. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I actually went to the Petrojam website, and although it has hyperlinks for these, for some of the previous audited statements, they seem to have been taken down. So even though I think they were previously published, they're now not available on the website. So could we also get, say, going back 5 years? 5 years.
We'd like to see the last 5 years of audited financial statements up to and including the year ending March 31, 2018. And who are the external auditors?
PwC.
All right, thank you. All right. I think we can move on to the next item. And this is to do with the group internal auditor now. And we have a response. We had questioned how effective the group internal auditor had been while all this was happening. And she had told us in the meeting, which has not been treated by Parliament so far as a meeting, but in which very important information came out, which we'd like to see minuted. And I've requested those minutes, and I haven't got them yet. But at that time, the group internal audit had indicated certain difficulties she was facing in getting access to what was happening within Petrojam. In this matrix here that has been presented, the OPM has said the group internal auditor's mandate is received from the PCJ, and that was the answer as to where her mandate is, the terms of reference that she operates by, which is set, which makes sense because she's employed at that level. The question was, does the group internal auditor receive his or her mandate to operate from PCJ, and what is that mandate in relation to the entities within the group? And she says the mandate, response is the mandate in relation to the entities within the group is to conduct internal audits. Well, you know, one would say that's not really a surprising response given that she's a group internal auditor. It doesn't tell us a whole lot. Oh boy. Do you have a role in the approval of audit plans for Petrojam and other subsidiaries? And the response, prior to October 2018, PCJ's internal auditor did not have a role in the approval of audit plans for Petrojam. So we have a group internal auditor in an entity which is a relatively, it's like a holding company, PCJ. It has operating subsidiaries, one of which is huge, Petrojam. But others include things like Wigton, am I right? She had no role in the approval of the audit plans for the internal auditors at that level, at the subsidiary level. She makes a point. Petrojam has a resident internal auditor who is employed to Petrojam and prepares an audit plan for Petrojam and reports to the board and the audit committee of Petrojam. Mr. Watson, could I ask you on that question? When was the decision taken for Petrojam to have its own internal auditor? When did that happen?
Sometime around between 2010, 2011. So prior to that, we would have been using the PCJ internal auditor. The Venezuelan directors made a request that they would like to have an independent person, not one of the shareholders. And so the company took a decision to hire its own internal.
So that was done at the instance of the Venezuelan partners. Yeah. They wanted to see an independent
that's correct.
Group internal
and
audit.
Likewise the corporate secretary.
As well.
So Chairman.
Yes, Mr.
The response that has been given to us, had you not asked that question, is also incorrect. Because the response from PCJ is that prior to December 2018, the PCJ internal auditor did not have a role in the approval of audit plans of Petrojam. But now Mr. Watson is telling us that this state of affairs existed after 2011.
Yes. That's when the internal auditor was hired.
So the answer given is not strictly correct.
It's not
because
strictly
there was
correct.
Prior to that, whenever that was it, you said 2010, 2011, you weren't very precise, but prior to that, when the Venezuelans insisted on the company having its own internal auditor, the group internal audit at PCJ level did in fact have a role in the approval of the audit plans for Petrojam.
Yeah, the PCJ auditor was involved in
that. So there was a period of time between 2010, 11 and 2018 or thereabouts when there was no involvement in the approval or development of the audit plan for Petrojam at the PCJ level.
I am not sure when it started or the delay, but certainly when I was there, we did have communication with the PCJ auditor. And then there was a lull after that.
Yes. The point is made here, there's no internal audit department in the other entities, so that the PCJ Group Internal Audit Department conducts internal audits at these entities. I assume these are the entities within the group other than Petrojam itself. And then it says the PCJ's Internal Audit Department prepares an internal audit plan for the PCJ Group and this. I don't know what the words "and this" is referring to there. So that was the answer. The next question, what mechanism was in place to ensure that the internal audit function was robust, effective, and operating properly? The mechanisms in place, and this is a response, the mechanisms in place in relation to audits at the Petrojam were as follows. In April 2011, Petrojam engaged an internal auditor who reports to the board of Petrojam and its audit committee, specifically for the internal audit function at that entity. There's an audit committee at Petrojam. The Petrojam audit plan is prepared by the Petrojam internal auditor and approved by the Petrojam audit committee. And it says Petrojam is also audited by PDVSA based on the joint venture agreement, and the statutory audit is conducted annually by the external auditors engaged by PCJ for the group. As a matter of course, the PCJ's internal auditor was not in receipt of Petrojam audit reports. I must say that is the most striking feature of all of this for me on this particular issue of the internal audit. How is it that the group internal auditor was not, as a matter of routine procedure, provided with the internal audit reports that were done at Petrojam, when Petrojam is the most important asset that PCJ has? And how is it that the PCJ board, with oversight over this, and allowing something like that to take place, is still in place? It's quite shocking. Next question. What were the other challenges that existed before corrective measures were which prevented Ms. Malcolm from being able to carry out effective oversight from a parent company point of view in relation to the internal audit function within Petrojam? What were the other challenges that existed? The challenges that existed can be seen as follows. This is a response. Petrojam has an internal auditor who does not have a reporting line to the PCJ Group Internal Audit Department. Petrojam's internal auditor reports to its board and audit committee at Petrojam, so there's no formal consistent transmission of reports to PCJ from Petrojam's internal audit department as a matter of course. And based on the reporting relationship, PCJ's group internal auditor could not direct the internal auditor at Petrojam. So that was a structural deficiency in the group internal audit arrangements that ensured that essentially Petrojam was sealed off, more or less, from effective oversight by the group internal audit department. And I think the board of PCJ, in allowing that to continue, was derelict in its duties. In what year did Ms. Malcolm start the audit of Petrojam, but was unable to complete the audit? And the answer is the audit to which reference was made was a procurement audit which commenced in June 2017. The reason given by the former general manager why the audit was put on hold was because the annual year-end external audit was in progress. So I've never heard that you can't do an internal audit because there's an external audit in progress. That to me should have been a red flag actually, because external auditors are looking at the accounts, and this was a procurement audit looking at the procurement methodologies that had been used within Petrojam. There should have been no reason why a general manager should be telling the group internal auditor that she can't do her internal audit of the procurement of a subsidiary because there's an external audit on the way. Is the group internal auditor here, Ms. Malcolm? Yes. Ms. Malcolm, when you received that response, which stopped you from completing your procurement audit in 2017 of Petrojam, what was your response to that at the time when you heard this?
Good afternoon. At the time when the response came to put the audit on hold, I realized that the statutory audit was in progress, and one of the things is that we want to ensure that that process is completed. So we were told that we would recommence in July, and that was a reasonable time. However, after July, we followed up, internal audit followed up, and that's when I explained in the previous meeting that we followed up. However, we were not able to continue that audit. Notwithstanding, the follow-up again was done in April at the start of the financial year, and
April 2018.
April 2018. So it's not like it was left hanging or no intention to continue. And at the time, the general manager now handed us over to the internal auditor at Petrojam and asked that the documents be sent to us. So we were in discussion with the internal auditor at Petrojam to get those documents.
So you were told that the statutory audit would be complete in July 2017, which was a near date, so you were prepared to let that just finish up so you could resume your internal audit of the procurement.
Yes.
And then what stopped you after that from doing it? Why did you have that hiatus between July and April 2018? What stopped you from continuing your internal audit of the procurement process?
We continued to follow up, and that's the point. So we had discussions with the general manager, and so in about September, we were told, when we had another meeting, the audit plan for Petrojam was requested. And so that document was sent to the general manager. We continued to follow because it has been a process of following up. And so...
Why did it take so much follow-up for you to continue an audit, which was part of your mandate? You could audit them. So why were you not... What was blocking you from doing it? I don't understand why you had to be consistently following up. What was stopping you from doing it?
Well, during that process, I didn't ask the question as to why, because one of the things that the process, the PBCJ came in and did an audit at that time. And the challenges we have is that sometimes in terms of resources and space constraints, so that audit was allowed to finish. And then we continued the follow-up. So,
did you ever finish the procurement audit?
No, that is still on hold because we intend to finish it, but at the time the Auditor General came in, and the other entities, Integrity Commission, and so it's the same records maybe they would be using. So we still intend to complete the scope of that work.
Mr. Chairman, at the same time, in the same year, they completed, the group internal auditor completed post-audit reviews. Just for those of us who are not audit experts, could you explain what is a post-audit review?
A post-audit review is when the audit team will go in to look at the implementation status of a previous audit and to report on the findings.
Previous audit by the
internal auditor.
Or from the external auditor?
Well, in this case, the PCJ internal auditor. So it can be a post-audit from an auditor looking at the recommendations.
So, so you haven't really answered the question then, because the question when was the date of the last audit of Petrojam? You are speaking to the post-audit reviews. What was the date of the audit that you were reviewing post-audit?
Well, the date of the audits we're reviewing, I think one was like in 2015. However, we still consider the post-audit an active review because that you go in and you're looking at the documents and you're reviewing it. So it's an actual item of review at that time.
But you're looking at documents related to issues that were raised in that 2015 audit. But the scope of your audit would not be wider than that in a post-audit review.
No, it would just be looking at the implementation status.
So the correct answer then to that question would be 2015 was the last audit of Petrojam completed by the group internal auditor.
No, I wouldn't say so, because the post-audit review, you go in and you look at the documents. So you're on site looking at the documents, and it is expected.
No, we didn't ask when was your last visit to Petrojam. I really don't see how a post-audit review and an audit can be said to be the same thing. I mean, it's either one or the other. If it was a post-audit review, it was reviewing progress against the findings of an audit done earlier. You're saying that earlier audit was 2015. So it seems to me that the correct answer was that the last audit of Petrojam, not post-audit review, the last audit of Petrojam.
Last internal audit.
Was completed by the group internal auditor in 2015.
Well, remember, if that, we weren't looking at it that way, but in the event...
Look at it that way for me.
Okay.
And just tell me, just confirm
Yes.
that 2015 was the last year.
The last audit you completed, Ms. Malcolm, was an audit that was done in 2015. All that's happened since was you had a post-audit review to see whether the findings and recommendations from the 2015 audit were implemented.
Okay, so looking at that concept, the last audit would be March 2017, when we finalized. So that was not a post-audit review, it was a new review. It was an audit.
In March 2017?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so that wasn't the procurement audit that you say you haven't finished yet. That's a different audit?
No, that's a different audit.
What were you auditing? What was the audit in March 2017? What were you auditing?
That audit was an audit of the payroll system at Petrojam.
So it was limited to payroll?
Could you repeat the question?
It was limited to payroll. It was a payroll audit?
Yes, that was a payroll audit.
And the 2015 audit that you had the post-audit review of, what were you auditing in 2015? What was that?
Could you let me just look at this? That was an audit of Petrojam's rebate to the Jamaica Private Power Company. So that's a post-audit review to which reference is being made for the May.
The rebate from Petrojam to the Jamaica Private Power Company. That's what you audited in 2015, and that's what the post-audit review was related to.
Yes, Chairman.
And then you did a payroll audit, which concluded in March 2017.
Yes, Chairman.
And you have an incomplete procurement audit, which you had started in 2017, but haven't been able to finish yet for various reasons.
Yes, Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I must tell you, I'm struck. These seem to be very narrowly scoped audits. I would have expected a more general audit of the operations and controls to be done by an internal audit department at least once every couple of years. But going back to 2015, I mean, we're only hearing of very, very narrow, narrowly scoped audits being done. It's almost as if the group internal audit was being deliberately kept out of the affairs of Petrojam. It hardly seems to even justify the group internal auditor if their role is so narrow.
If the 2015 audit was just of one contractual arrangement with one customer of Petrojam, yeah, one supplier, well, Jamaica Private Power Company, I assume it's a purchaser, it's a customer, yeah. And that's all that was done up until the 2017 March one, which related to payroll, just a payroll audit. So it's these are very narrowly scoped internal audits that were done between 2015 and 2017. And procurement, which is where we've seen a lot of the problems that hasn't happened at all. It's been incomplete, and we're in 2019 now, and a 2017 audit, internal audit of Petrojam hasn't yet been complete on that issue.
Just to clarify, Mr. Chairman, there were other audits. So while it may be that what we do is we look at areas and audits. So there were other audits outside of those.
Perhaps you could provide us with a specific listing of the audit that the PCJ's group internal audit has done in relation to Petrojam in the last 4 years, and the dates of those audits, because we're not getting a very complete picture based on what you're saying.
Well, what I did, I just looked at the period we're looking at for 2016, 2017, 17, 18. And those audits were the post-audit reviews. So the listing can be provided, but I just want to clarify that there were other audits that were done. So.
Yes, well, Mr. Campbell and then Ms. Hannah. Yes.
Chairman, thank you. Madam Group Auditor, have you had the benefit of seeing the report, the internal audit reports from Petrojam itself? Because whilst you're doing your audits, have you seen the ones which are done by the internal auditor from Petrojam?
We have had sight of some of them on request.
And did any of those reports warrant your further investigation of the entity? The methodologies employed by that auditor, because I believe that there are international practices and best practices involved. And were you at any time concerned that the methodology employed by that auditor was not up to par to deal with the various areas of operations that this entity had to deal with? Because that, I think, would assist us. Because whilst you are set apart, you're sitting in another place, internal audits are being done by this auditor, and those reports, if they did reveal malpractice or otherwise, they ought to have come to your attention, and then you would have scaled the thing up to the board of PCJ or as...
But you know, Mr. Campbell, Ms. Malcolm has already indicated that the internal auditor of Petrojam didn't report to her and did not routinely forward his audit reports to her. It was only at courtesy, if she requested it, that she would see it.
Well, I take your point, Chairman, but having carried out her own investigation, any of those, because she would have had sight of those audits, and to, well, recommendations would have been made as to whether compliance with the various practices would have been, in train. But if they weren't, then,
So, Ms. Malcolm, just quickly, if you could, because I think we've run out of time for today's sitting. And then Ms. Hannah has a question as well. So if you could, were you satisfied with that the internal audit being function within Petrojam itself was up to satisfactory standards?
Based on the reports that I saw, the reports seemed satisfactory.
Mr. Richardson, you are the group general manager. We've heard for maybe the last couple of weeks, Ms. Malcolm come and give her testimony on the gaps with trying to do the audit in the group of companies. Since you have been there, what have you implemented to solve the dilemma to which she has been experiencing?
With regards to the question, and afternoon everyone, we're looking to see how we can restructure the governance matters with regards to the PCJ and its group. One of the documents that was done by the PCJ, I think in 2016, we had a consultant come on board to look at the governance structure at the PCJ and how it should actually fit in with what private sector does. And there's some matters that have been outlined, and we want to address those. And so we're looking to take those recommendations forward, and I know we have had some initial discussions with PS Temple as well. So we're looking to implement the recommendations from that previous consultant's report.
Mr. Richardson, just,
I can also
if I may,
state,
just ask a question,
there's
please.
just one quick thing.
Before you go to that quick point. You say that that particular study was done in 2016.
I think so, yes.
This is where 3 years hence. Were those recommendations acted upon prior to your assuming this particular role?
They were presented to the minister because I was a part of that meeting in another capacity. But yes.
When did you start? When did you become the acting GM?
24th of December, 2018.
2018, December 2018?
24th, yes.
Christmas Eve?
Yes.
Okay.
A Christmas Eve firing and a Christmas Eve firing.
Members, it's 106. The clerk has indicated, yeah. Yes, but I just want to have an understanding as to when we're going to, because they need to prepare for the 2 o'clock sitting there saying, yeah.
Mr. Richardson, can you continue for me, please?
Right, so just to add as well that with regards to the modifications since, Ms. Malcolm is also on the PetroJam Audit Committee. She is now on board with that. There is a recommendation, I think, from the chairman or from the general manager. So she is an invitation, so she's invited to sit on PetroJam's Audit Committee. And our group GCFO, Mr. Clark, is also on our technical and financial committee of PetroJam.
The specific question, though, was if it was done in 2016, what do you attribute to its non-implementation?
That's a very loaded question, but I'll frame it this way. There is a lot that has to be changed within the law to allow the appropriate structures to take place within the group. Because the PBMA doesn't support a group structure, and so there are some technicalities to it that just can't allow it to be implemented off the bat just like that. So what we are going to do is take some recommendations to the PS and hopefully get some recommendations coming out of her office to move forward with implementing the changes.
I don't really buy that, Mr. Richardson. Okay. That explanation about legal impediments to a group internal audit structure being robust. I mean, maybe your response is wider than internal audit, perhaps. You haven't really elucidated it in detail. But I'm just wondering whether, for example, the Port Authority, which has operating subsidiaries, what happens there? There may be other entities in the public sector that are statutory bodies with companies that are subsidiaries to it. And, we haven't heard before that there have been any issues with the ability to have an effective group internal audit. A lot of these structures are not derived from the Companies Act. They're just derived from proper international best practice as to how group audit, internal audit is to be done. And if everybody is cooperating and the boards of the subsidiaries are cooperating, there should be no problem whatsoever in having a robust system in place.
So Chairman,
yes.
that is recognized, and so the group internal auditor, as has been indicated, now sits on the PetroJam Audit Committee, and there are other arrangements that have been put in place for other personnel at PCJ to sit on various committees of PetroJam. So even though there are some legal matters that perhaps need sorting, administrative arrangements have been put in place, and we're continuing a review to see what additional administrative arrangements need to be put in place to be able to enhance the governance arrangements.
This is the last question.
Yeah, if and when we are returning to deal with this particular issue, that a copy of the shareholder agreement between the PCJ and PBCJ be made available, because I believe that there are some limitations which have been imposed by that agreement, and I suspect that having a closer look at it may assist us in dealing with them.
The members asking for a copy of the shareholders agreement between PCJ and the Venezuelan entity that holds a 49% shareholding in Petrojam be made available to members of the committee.
That was noted, Chairman.
If I know you said it was the final question,
well, it was.
Members are having a little concern here.
Oh.
And they have asked me to ask Mr. Richardson, what was your role prior to being appointed on the Christmas Eve to this post as Group General Manager?
My role prior to the appointment on Christmas Eve, Manager of Oil and Gas at the PCJ.
What?
Manager of Oil and Gas Exploration at the PCJ.
Okay. Thank you.
So would anyone care to, before any other business and the date of the next meeting? What?
As it relates to the date of this next meeting, Mr. Chairman.
On Tuesday.
No.
Apparently, there's some polling going on of the members of the Joint Select Committee. Is it a Joint Select Committee? Yes. Looking at the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Well, the clerk says that the polling is not yet complete.
But, Chairman, I'm
yes,
asking,
yes, Member Warmington.
as much as I'd like for us to complete item 7, I'm asking that we set another date apart from next week, Tuesday. I'd love to be here, but the issue is that the government members will be in a caucus next week. We should have been there this week, but we came to deal with this week. So I'm asking for consideration that we set a next date apart from next week.
The government members won't be able to
attend next week.
As much as we'd love to have you.
I'd love to get it concluded. But the issue the last 2 weeks we have dealt with issues that weren't, as important as this. So I'm asking that we find next date apart from next week.
What about Wednesday?
Any day you want to say.
We have at 2. Well, on a Wednesday, the clerk isn't sure if PAAC is meeting on the Wednesday morning on the 13th.
Right, could you find out then, and if not, we could,
yes, if we can have it on the morning of the 13th,
if
which is a Wednesday,
we
would be happy to accommodate the government side. Out of a spirit of, goodwill and cooperation. So we will get that confirmed. And we will send out the notice. So would someone move for the adjournment? Thank you, Mr. Campbell. Seconded by Dr. Guy.
Happy birthday, Jason. I just wanted to tell you that I'm very proud of you. You're getting good grades in school, and at home you've really been helping me with the chores. I hope you have a great day.